I'm just thinking of a funny. I went out with a few of my mates on Friday night. None of them are Christians, and one of them I'd only met once before. And he, halfway through the evening, he said, "Why is your nickname the Reverend?" I said, "Well, it ain't a nickname. I am." And he was so surprised. I don't know if that's good or bad, whether he was surprised, but. I tell that just because it's good to hang out with people who are not Christians and go and tell it, because you'll have opportunity to tell them some good news. Right, I'm going to tell a little bit of a story, my story. I'm going to tell a little bit of a story of the church I'm part of, and I'm going to tell you, well, it'll unfold where we're going to go. I don't want to give you too much of a heads up. I've been working at what is now called City Hope Church in Bermondsey for 28 years in May. I know it's a lot. I must have started before I left school. But 28 years I've been there. And I found out that the very first pastor of that church, when it was Drummond Road Baptist Church, was also a Brown. His name was J. Alexander Brown, the Reverend J. Alexander Brown. He was no relation. I've established that because my family weren't Christians back then. In fact, I'm the first Christian in my family as far as I can work out. And while that Mr. Brown was preaching the good news of Jesus from the pulpit of Drummond Road Baptist Church, my ancestors were publicans and prize fighters just down the road in Deptford. God works miracles, doesn't he, and changes lives. So the Reverend Brown was there in the 1860s proclaiming the good news of Jesus, but we're still there now doing the same. There's been an unbroken witness in that very same building since the 1860s, still speaking up for Jesus. And our part of London is changing, and like so many places are changing today, too slowly for some and too fast for many. You know, some people love the rapid sort of gentrification of our area, and others not so much. But regardless of change, some things never change. And I've done a little bit of research, and one of the pastors at Drummond Road by the name of Derek Punchard, who was a minister in the mid-60s, he said this back in 1966, "Today we face the challenge of presenting people with Jesus Christ in new communities and a new society as Bermondsey is being rebuilt. But the people are the same. Their need is the same, and Jesus Christ is the same answer to that need." We mustn't forget that, must we? The answer is always Jesus. That's like the cliche for Sunday school kids. When they're asked a question, it's generally say Jesus and they'll get it right. But the answer is Jesus. And back in the 1860s, after C.H. Spurgeon founded and funded our church building, he could have been talking about us today when he said this: "Let eloquence be flung to the dogs rather than souls be lost. What we want is to win souls. They're not won by flowery speeches." It's a challenge, isn't it? First of all, it's a challenge that we must be passionate to win souls for Christ. And we don't win them with flowery speeches. We win them with power and authority and grace and mercy and love and kindness and all the fruits of the Spirit. So those words should be a challenge for us today. And when I look back over my years at City Hope, what is now City Hope Church, our church, I think, has got a well-deserved reputation for effectively reaching into some of the more marginalised communities, into working class communities, and which it's done, it's in our DNA, you know, from when Spurgeon first planted that church there all those years ago. But sadly, my experience is many churches struggle. They struggle to connect with working class communities and working class people, and probably because they found it so difficult, because there's been such a cultural disconnect, some churches don't seem to make that a priority at all. And the result is a large swathe of the population of the UK are effectively excluded from hearing the gospel. There's large parts of our country that we live in today, our people, who don't really connect with the gospel. And then you could say, if only someone would write a book about it, highlighting the class differences in the UK, and maybe that would help. Think, what's that? Why didn't you write one, Paul? Well, I have. That's a long intro to saying I've written a book. There's the cover of it. I haven't written it on my own. You can see I co-authored this book called Invisible Divides with Natalie Williams, who is the CEO of a charity called Jubilee Plus, which really focuses and assists and helps churches on helping the marginalised in lots of different ways, whether it's through people victims of sex trafficking, or people in serious debt, or affected by abuse, all sorts of things. They are able to speak to power, meet with politicians and the like. But I co-authored this book with Natalie, published by SPCK, and it comes out on the 21st of April. And you're invited to the launch event at our building in Bermondsey. And you think, that's miles away. Well, it's only 20 minutes to London Bridge, isn't it? 20 minutes to London Bridge, one stop on the tube, and you're virtually there. So I'll send Glenn the details. You are seriously very welcome to come along to that. It's really weird plugging yourself like this, but I do genuinely think that otherwise I wouldn't have written it. This is for the good of the church, to help the church effectively reach wider and deeper. I'll just give you a couple of endorsements that were given. Some of you may have heard of Amy Orr Ewing, Dr. Amy Orr Ewing, author, speaker, theologian. She said, Invisible Divides is a much needed read for all of us, a must buy for anyone who cares about the church and its mission today. And a fellow called Fergus Scarf, who is the UK regional director of God TV, he said, Natalie and Paul have written a powerful book that can transform church life across the UK and beyond. I hope it does. Without being tricky, I really hope it does. Because I firmly believe the church should be a glorious mix of people from all walks of life. You know, all classes and cultures and subcultures. You know, I've got friends who I would never be friends with in any other context. I would never be mates with doctors and barristers and members of parliament if it wasn't for the fact that I was in the church, right? It's only because of Jesus that we can be truly devoted to one another. And if you're someone who feels comfortable in the company of the slightly more well-heeled, right, the slightly more middle class, I'd challenge you to make friends outside of your comfort zone, whether that is Ukrainians or whether that is somebody from another nation, but also whether that is somebody from a working class background. How many of your friends are labourers or, I don't know, van drivers or postmen or something like that? Let's cross those divides, those what are often divides we don't see and don't think are there, to reach a wider part of this nation. The working classes have increasingly been portrayed as a cultural disgrace. You know, do you remember it used to be the salt of the earth, and now very often it's scum of the earth. But we must remember we are all created in God's image. Let me read to you those well-known words from Genesis chapter 1, from verses 26 and 27. Then God said, let us make human beings in our image, to be like us. They will reign over the fish in the sea, and the birds in the sky, the livestock, all the wild animals on the earth, and the small animals that scurry along the ground. So God created human beings in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them. That well-known truth has profound implications for us because it insists that all people from all backgrounds are created in the image of God. That's male and female, that's all races, that's all ethnicities, that's all cultures, that's all classes created in the image of God. And you think, well, obviously, Paul, but often we don't live like that is obvious. It's not controversial. We should all sign up to it. But there is a problem. We're all so different. Right? And that's what makes it difficult. Different nationalities and different races and different sexes, ages, different backgrounds, jobs, life experience, different classes, and we find it much easier to connect with our own, whatever our own is. People who don't look like me and don't talk like me, who don't like the same things as me, are not as easy to get on with. So we have to do things differently. A good friend of mine who's a prominent Anglican minister, he was on the General Synod for years, and he said this. He said, the working class are, I believe, a missiologically significant cultural group. There's lots of long words there. By this, I mean that they are a group of people with particular cultural values, customs and ideas in common that we need to take into account if we're to engage in effective mission towards and with them, as we would with any other cultural group. And this is why I think there's been such an invisible divide, because we don't see the difference of culture between classes in the UK. And therefore, because the church is predominantly middle class in this country, we miss large parts of our nation when we reach out. And even if we do reach people and we see them saved, I don't know if you've experienced it here, how often do people not find home in a church community? You think they're saved, oh, they're baptised, and then where are they? They've gone. Because there's such a cultural disconnect, and we need to just review and look at the way we do things and how we communicate and what are important to us. Now, because the human body, as we read in that illustration in 1 Corinthians 12, the human body has many parts, but the many parts make up one whole body. So it is with the body of Christ. Some of us are Jews, some are Gentiles, some are slaves, some are free. But we have all been baptised into one body by one Spirit, and we all share the same Spirit. We should be one. And I've seen it in churches, little groups and little cliques that don't really connect, and they may even be sitting together physically in church groups, in church meetings. But we need to be one. And that's a wonder. The church can speak to the world around us like that. Think, look at them. I've never seen anything like that. And one of the things we need to do is to not make projects out of people. And that's quite difficult when you're serving and giving and meeting a need. And sometimes the needs are very obvious. And then you can start a ministry around, for it, I don't know, helping single teenage mums, right? But then it becomes a project, and you can pat yourself on the back for doing good things, but you're not really connecting with people as an equal and imparting dignity and sharing life together. It's like, I've got something from my position of security to give to you, you poor person. And it's good to a degree, but can you see what I'm saying? We need to impart dignity and shape. Just because your life is different to mine, you're no less than me. So much of our fallen society is about privilege. There's white privilege, there's male privilege, there's having more than enough money, financial privilege. That's linked to educational privilege. You know, the middle-class education system serves middle-class kids. I've read lots around it. It's just a thing. There are so many ways we can be privileged, and if we're not careful, we can assume that position of superiority. We don't even mean to do it most of the time. I remember reading a book, reading an article about a Methodist minister. He'd just started his new church. So what he thought it'd be a good idea is to sort of test the church a little bit. So it was in a nice area, and he spent the week not shaving. He didn't wash his hair. He went down the charity shop and got some old clothes. And he got an old bobble hat on, and he'd grown his beard, and he splashed a bit of lager over himself so he just smelt a bit. And he turned up at his church where he'd just got a job. Just to see, I mean, it's a bit nasty really, isn't it? But just to see how people would react. And people didn't know how to talk to him. They didn't know, they certainly didn't welcome him. In fact, somebody went and stood by the cars in case he was going to break into the cars. Right? And it was a big challenge for his particular church when he done the reveal, you know, it's me. And people were impacted by that because it highlighted some of their unconscious bias and some of their ways of reacting to people. It's a challenge, isn't it? But even the things that we do, that we think everyone does, can be difficult. You know, hospitality. How do you show hospitality? When hospitality is important, isn't it? In fact, I think it's a spiritual gift, isn't it? Right? I remember when we first went to church and people started inviting us round for supper, right? Would you like to come for supper? Or some people call it dinner, you know. Would you like... Well, you think that's normal, and it's normal to me now. I had never been invited. I was 25 years old. I'd never been to somebody else's house for dinner other than my immediate family, my aunts and uncles, and maybe one of my grandparents. And so to be invited to someone's house for supper was just the weirdest thing, right? So, and I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying be aware that people may find it really uncomfortable. And maybe that's not the first way you show hospitality to someone, for example, right? What about communication, right? We all talk to one another, surely. How we talk to one another. I'm going to use an illustration from you, right, actually, because I interviewed him, I jotted some stuff down for the book, and this bit actually finds itself in the book. Because I chatted to Glenn, because I remember when Glenn first came to the church that I was part of, right? I remember when he first walked in. And this is about communication. This is Glenn's words. I wasn't culturally prepared for my first experience of a church meeting. And that's an understatement. I was disturbed to see men hugging each other. The men I knew didn't do that. And people kept asking all sorts of intrusive personal questions. Was it church or a police convention? Right? But that's interesting, isn't it? Because I spoke to a number of my friends and they wouldn't even consider that. But I've spoke to others, and like Glenn, you think, why are they asking? Why do they want to know where I live and what I do? Why are they asking those questions? It's like, is he a policeman or something? When we meet people in a church context, and we've got to use a bit of wisdom and we've got to gauge, you know, where we think people are from. But it's probably best not to start quizzing people about what they do or where they're from. Right? Keep it neutral. We talk about the weather. Ask them about their football team or something. But can you see what I'm saying? There's just a small illustration of we think, we're communicating, and actually we're not. We're putting more barriers in place. And and the divides that are there are invisible, and we want to break those down. Middle class people are two-faced was the immediate answer I got from one working class Christian lady. Right, in my church this was. I said, what do you think about middle class people? Middle class people are two-faced. Of course, they're no more two-faced than any other people from any other background, right? But I understand what she means. Right, now let me illustrate again. And I hope this is a bit of a seminar more than a sermon, but I hope this is helping you as you think how I'm communicating, connecting with people. So this was a conversation between two people I knew was interesting, right? So I used to have connections with a local charity, and there was a very upper middle class trustee of this charity. very, very gentlemanly guy. He was an ex-army officer, did a lot for the charity. And there was a working class employee of the same charity. They were similar in age. They were both retired age, about 67, 68, something like that. And the conversations that I observed between these two white English men was almost farcical, right? So the working class man was always brutally honest with everything he said. And if he thought it, he invariably said it, right? There was no filter, even if it caused offence, which it often did. Because honesty was very important to him. Well, it's true, you know. Whereas this middle-class trustee would be much more measured and guarded with his choice of words, and he'd take care not to be offensive, right? So sometimes he wouldn't say everything he thought, but the result was inevitably offence, because the middle-class man was perceived to be a liar and two-faced, because he didn't say what he thought, and the working class man was just seen to be downright rude. So these two men would often end up arguing. You think, it's because they just didn't understand they're coming from different cultures and they didn't get it. So communication is an important aspect. Obviously, if we're going to communicate the gospel, we want to do it effectively. What about money and generosity? I'm highlighting these class differences, which are invisible divides, hoping to make them visible so we can understand a little bit better. Is that all right? Attitudes to money, I think, is one of the factors we look at in the book. I remember as a teenager, I worked for my family run a builders merchants in Bexley. And during the school holidays, if I didn't go out early, my grandfather would invariably come and grab me out and say, come on, there's lorries to load up. So as a young teenager, I'd be working in the yard, school holidays and weekends. And when we were delivering building materials to the nicer houses around Chislehurst and Bromley, I don't think we came down as far as Sevenoaks. We might have done. But mostly, I'd look at the job ticket and think, oh, no, I've got to go Chislehurst. Because they don't give you a tip, right? Right? And the man in the modest council house would invariably give you the, yeah, son, take that, and they'd put a £5 note in your hand or something like that. So there's a cultural disconnect, and I've observed this in church life as well. And people I know are very, very generous, right? I know. But certain aspects of their life comes across as being a bit tight because they won't give the tip. Do you see what I'm saying? I'm not saying one's right and one's wrong. I'm just saying let's understand one another because we can be more effective for the gospel. And so many people, middle-class people I've met, don't understand the whole thing of living from payday to payday. People literally counting every penny. And they've got a job and they're meeting their bills, but if anything interrupts or intrudes on that, then things can go badly wrong very quickly. And I've spoken to middle-class Christian friends who say, well, Paul, I've got no money this week, right? And which could be a bit upsetting if people, because one lady I spoke to, she literally said that to me. She was panicking. She came to me and said, oh, I've got no money. It's the end of the month in a few days and I've got nothing left. Well, I knew, because I knew her well and she was a friend, that she had thousands in savings, right? Now, some people may take offence at that. Can you see? So it's a communication breakdown, it's a cultural breakdown, attitude to money differences. These are things we need to be aware of if we really want to take the good news of Jesus to the people around us. And we don't just want to be a cosy club of Christians enjoying one another's company. I recently did a funeral for a local Bermondsey family. And they sent me a really lovely card after I'd taken the funeral. And among other things, they just said on this card, well, you're one of us. And I thought, that is a real compliment. And that is a challenge as well. And I asked, how do people see you? Are you one of them, or are you one of us? Can you see? I'd connected with the family, culturally, hopefully, that they trusted me. And if people trust you, then they'll be more open to the good news of Jesus Christ, to proclaiming hope and love and life to people. We must be creative and accessible in our social events. I don't know if you put on events here, but I can think of things that we did in one church. We planted a church in Gravesend a number of years ago before we moved to Bermondsey. The church was in a school on an estate, and the pastor at the time decided in his wisdom that we would do a cheese and wine evening, right? Well, the sort of people who live local were not cheese and wine evening people, right? So one fella turned up and he saw this table with bottles of wine. So rather than getting a little glass of Malbec and sipping it and tasting it and enjoying it, he took the bottle from under the table and was standing in the corner, and he'd done this bottle of wine, right? So there was a cultural disconnect which could have got very messy. Then he proceeded to try and get the microphone out of the hands of the leader of the meeting. Whereas I've also been involved in a karaoke night in church, which culturally worked. I don't know, was you at one of them karaoke's, Anne? Oh, mate, that was such fun. Anyway, but it's understanding who. There's nothing wrong with cheese and wine evenings. I love them, right? But make sure you understand who your target audience is, who you're trying to attract to Jesus by putting on a social event, and just be aware of that. Raising up working class leaders is one of the biggest challenges. I think you've got Glenn Walsh in this church, which I always find quite amusing, right? That he ended up in lovely Sevenoaks, right? And we've. Yeah, our paths have crossed on numerous occasions. I still think it's funny. I get that imposter syndrome, right? Especially I've written a book now. Blimey, I was a bricklayer. Yeah. But raising up working class leaders is a genuine challenge, and partly because so much is dependent on formal academic attainment, right? Let me read to you what the Reverend Lynn Cullins wrote to the Church Times. I quote this in the book as well. This is a long plug, isn't it? The Reverend Lynn Cullins, she said, at a regional church leadership meeting a few years ago, one of the clergy recounted a phone call that she had received. A young woman with a strong working class accent had phoned her to ask whether she could discuss her strong call she was feeling to ordination. When the woman arrived, she was wearing leopard print leggings and Ugg boots and had bleached blonde hair and eyelashes thick with mascara. The priest expressed amazement at the way in which the woman articulated a passionate personal faith and a sincere and informed vocation to ministry. So did you put her through to the diocese then? She was asked. Oh no, she laughed. Of course not. What would they have made of me sending someone like her through to them? I think, wow. There's a cultural disconnect. There's a bias, right? We need to challenge those feelings. Maybe those feelings are in you, right? Don't overlook unschooled, ordinary people. We mustn't overlook those who have been transformed into leaders through grace and grit, and who, like Peter and the other apostles, might be considered unschooled ordinary men, if you read the NIV, Acts chapter 4. Because if we do that, we could be missing some great men and women of God. Because we think, well, they're not suitable, are they? Like that lady who applied for ministry with the Anglican Church. There's a fella, I love the history of the church, and I love the history of our community. And I've been reading around, and I found a guy called Tommy Meadows. Tommy Meadows grew up on the mean streets of Bermondsey in the mid-19th century, and mate, it was rough then. I mean, it was rough in the mid-20th century, and it's getting a bit nicer now. But in mid-19th century, it was rough. And his schooling was rudimentary at best, but formal education wasn't really needed for him because he was an apprentice rope maker. You know, the hemp ropes that all the boats had, and there's the docks at Surrey Docks. So rope making was a thing then, and Meadows' neighbours would have known his trade without having to ask him, because rope makers carried with them the constant aroma of tar, because they used to waterproof those hemp ropes that were woven They used to waterproof them with tar. So he would have turned around the corner and they would have think, oh, he's one of them rope makers. And it's just part of life. But his lack of education didn't stop him writing to C.H. Spurgeon, right? This is an amazing story. He heard Spurgeon preach and he wrote to him anxiously asking, how am I to find Jesus? How am I to know that he died for me? And Spurgeon's written response, we think that he was a superstar preacher in them days, wasn't he? But he took out time to write a response. He concluded his response by saying this: there is a cross and a bleeding God-man upon it. Look to him and be saved. And Meadows did. He looked to Christ, he was soundly saved, and almost immediately he began preaching on the streets surrounding where Spurgeon was then, which was the New Street Chapel in Southwark, right, not far from Southwark Bridge. And he was brimming with gospel passion, this guy. But some of the church members who heard him preach did not approve. Right? They were outraged, in fact. They were outraged at what they called his want of education, and that his standard of spoken English left something to be desired. And they complained to Spurgeon himself, and they said Medhurst should be stopped. They raged at Spurgeon, and so Spurgeon agreed to meet the young preacher, right, the new convert who's gone out on the streets preaching, to discuss their complaints. And his response was definite and sharp. So Tommy Meadows, the apprentice rope maker, when he was called in about his want of education and his command of the English language, he said this: I must preach, and I shall preach, and I shall preach unless you cut off my head. Right. So, and Spurgeon, thankfully, was suitably impressed, and he decided decapitation wasn't necessary. And Tommy Meadows continued in his ministry, and he didn't stay on the streets preaching. His ministry matured. He went on to pastor churches in London, in Coleraine in Ireland, in Glasgow in Scotland, and on the south coast in Portsmouth. During his ministry, that rough apprentice rope maker from Bermondsey, whose standard of spoken English had so shocked the polite members of the church, went on to personally baptise almost 1,000 converts that is known about. He was a respected preacher. In fact, somebody said, I'm paraphrasing this, but somebody said when Spurgeon was a guest speaker at his church in Portsmouth, and somebody said to one of the women, how did you like Mr. Spurgeon's preaching? And they said he was all right, but he's copied our Mr. Medhurst in his style, right? So they liked Tommy Medhurst better. But his story, and that story, it challenged me, and it should challenge us today. How gratifying would it be to see more and more men and women raised up from this nation's neglected communities into leadership positions, from the towns and estates where Christians seem to have fled and then forgotten, right? From the communities that are still suffering because the traditional industries have long died and there's nothing that's replaced it. There's been generational unemployment or low-paid gig economy jobs. Those communities are today's equivalent of those vicious Victorian slums. I don't know what their equivalent here is in Sevenoaks, but you will have working class communities here, I know, right? Who's reaching them? Who's culturally aware enough to reach out with the gospel to them? Who's going to go with the eternal message of hope? The message of such good news, essential news. The message that Tommy Meadows preached so passionately. The Bible paints a glorious picture of what the church will look like when Jesus returns. You know, at the end of the age, the fullness of what the Apostle Paul wrote to the Galatians when he said, look, there's neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free. There is no male or female, for you are all one in Christ. That will become a reality. What John saw in his revelation was a great multitude that no one could number, from every nation, all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes with palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, "Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb." That's everyone together. No one should be excluded. That's what the church will look like at the end. A beautiful, diverse multitude. Thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people with vastly differing backgrounds and lives, worshipping together in complete unity in Christ. There are all kinds of divides we can put in place, consciously and subconsciously. Right? Mostly the intention is to protect, actually. That's why we put those divides in. It's to protect. It's not intentional to keep others out, but we maybe feel a little bit fearful, or we like what we've got. Yet so often, it's not good enough. And it's such a challenge to us all. So it's to us all. I'm not having a go at anyone. This is just how we are. But if we are intentionally looking to highlight the divides so they can be smashed down, wouldn't it be wonderful to see every chair in here full up? And then you think, how are we going to get the rest of them in? We might have to go to 2 services. And there's people from all backgrounds and all walks of life. And there's some people do some strange things. There's a lady who comes to our church now. She's part Thai, half Japanese, right? She's got some social issues and I think a little bit of mental health issues, right? She comes every Sunday. She heckles regularly, which I love a heckler, me, right? So I get a bit disconcerted when you're so silent. But I can't understand how she's heckling because she's got such a strong accent, right? This sort of Japanese Thai lady. And some people used to think it's a bit disruptive. I thought, that's all right, we can cope. I've got a microphone, I can speak louder than her. But one time I was in mid-flow preaching from the book of Acts, right? I'm cracking on, I'm really enjoying myself. And I saw her get up from her seat and she walked up the aisle, she came up to the front, right in front of me. And on the little table next to me, she put a load of little gifts. She gave me some tea light candles, right? And a packet of digestive biscuits and a tin of hot dogs in brine, right? I mean, it's the most random thing. But bless her heart, she just come with a gift for me like that. There was no cultural, social graces being. Yeah, she wears a little pretend, like a fancy dress shop police lady's hat and a high-vis vest as she walks around our local shops, by our local shop. She's anyway, wonderful. But my point is, we should be able to cope with some of this silliness, We should be able to have fun with it. As the church family, as we preach Jesus to all sorts of people. Let's not have a dominant culture in church. Let's be ready to change our understanding. I read this morning about the government's going to encourage families to take in Ukrainian refugees, right? So that's going to be a challenge. People come in from a different culture, with a different language. We're going to have to make effort. We're going to have to make effort to understand, maybe even to learn language. Certainly to understand some of the culture and the trauma. So we'll intentionally do that because we're going to want to reach out and connect, aren't we? To serve and help. If we would do that for Ukrainians or Syrians or whatever culture that, when we lived in Gravesend all them years ago, there was a large Sikh community in Gravesend, to learn to understand the culture, to better reach out. So that there will always be misunderstandings and we should hold these things very light. Think, I've mucked it up again, I'm sorry. Because we say and do things which are normal to us and which can be insulting to other cultures. We should all be very open and open-palmed with this stuff. And if we do, we can reach the nations that are on our doorstep, we can reach the classes that are on our doorstep, and the church will flourish, and the church will grow, and the church will reflect what heaven is, or what heaven's gonna be. It's exciting. And it's not just for them. And then when I say them, I mean the person in the chair next to you. It's for you. It's for all of us. Doesn't matter what your personality type is. You can still do this. When people outside our churches look in on us, they should notice how we love each other despite our differences. Our love for each other should be more visible than ever. Look at how they love one another. And our love should point to Jesus. For all followers of Christ, our identity first and foremost is that we are children of God, and that should unite us all. You know, one day we will see the fulfillment of that. But for now, let's play our part of crossing invisible divides and seeing people from all classes and cultures come together to know him and to worship him and to serve him together on an equal footing. To him be the glory.